Hello and welcome to F1 Into the Barrier with me, George Close, reviewing the Barcelona Grand Prix. Ladies and gentlemen, remember who you are. Lewis fucking Hamilton just won an extraordinary race. Really extraordinary. The whole weekend was poised from the end of qualifying. Why? Because the Ferrari upgrades, these 8 upgrades that they have brought, seem to have significantly closed the gap. Now, Lewis was a little bit off in practice. He gave up FP1 so that the Ferrari reserve driver could have a go. So he felt like he was behind. But in qualifying, he found some balance. And he was 600ths of a second off pole position. And if you look at the ghost car, in the corners he was quicker. You might expect that from Ferrari. And the Mercedes was quicker on the straight. So he was poised. But going into the race, everyone still felt, this is slightly advantaged Mercedes. Leclerc had crashed out in qualifying. It was 2 against 1 at the front. George had looked quick. Kimi's obviously quick in race pace. They seem to have the double advantage. And in hindsight, it was probably won with tyre choice and strategy right at the start. Lewis starts on the soft. Those around him start on the mediums. And what did that give Lewis Hamilton? If you need to give Lewis Hamilton anything to win a race, you give him an aggressive strategy. And that's what he played out. He forced George Russell to pit too early. George commented on this himself. He said he was actually nursing the tyres because he was expecting to go longer. From that moment, you saw a little bit of Mercedes disarray. So, anyway, let's hit the start of the race. Start of the race, reasonable launches. This whole Ferrari power launch at the beginning seems to have been nerfed now. The new rules have slightly changed that. Doesn't seem to have such a powerful launch from behind. But still, they got off behind okay. One of the Racing Bulls ran wide. But largely everyone's setting off in order. Leclerc manages to jump 3 places. That's interesting. And this gap behind, you had this really interesting front of the race between Lewis, George, Antonelli, and then amazingly, Lando Norris. We can talk more about him later. And then there was the best of the next rest, which was Verstappen, Leclerc, who, again, listen, he qualified out of position. It was very Leclerc to crash. Don't think you can blame the brakes quite so much for his crash in qualifying as he could in Monaco. Hadjar unfortunately dropped and have to work his way back through the race, but he did. He did manage to make those places back. So we have this race unfolding at the front, and it's going into this first stop. And I think that's where it felt lost. In that first stint, George looked pretty in control, actually. He lost speed later on. He talked about this in his interviews. He felt that towards the end of the stints, he felt he was not quite holding together. And you saw Kimi Antonelli being able to put pressure on him in those stints. But there was some talk about, will they let Antonelli pass? Listen, 1, they're in a championship battle, so no, that's not going to happen. 2, George was quicker on the Saturday, earned the right to be out in front. He definitely earned to have the pit stop calls. And he fended off Antonelli. Antonelli was moaning at one point, but you've got to pass them. If you want to get that jump, you've got to pass him. Anyway, he does go on to pass George, but reliability issues become a problem. I think what we see as the race unfolds is the Ferraris are getting through. They cycle from the soft tyre to the hard tyre, and they get their initial hard tyre stint out the way. And at that point, it still looked maybe slightly advantage Mercedes. And then it was the medium tyre stint, where Ferrari had been aggressive, and because of the tyres they had available, they could go aggressively at the 3-stop strategy, whereas Mercedes was still a little bit unsure at that point. He then managed to do the magic stint on the magic medium. The magic medium for a lot of drivers was very strong, and you suddenly saw he was taking 2.5 seconds out every lap, eating through. He was lucky that Lando pitted out of his way, actually, so he didn't have to go through Lando. There were a few points, actually, where I was thinking maybe Ferrari could have left Leclerc out a lap longer, a lap here, just to see if they could disrupt the Mercedes at the front, just where he was. He came from 10th, so he wasn't racing for the win. But at the same time, you're actually looking back at the data and where he was, it seems that had he done that, he was losing about 4 seconds a lap. So he probably wouldn't have made much of a difference. And the 4 seconds was coming through the delta that drivers had from undercutting him. At the end of the day, you've got to give credit to Ferrari's strategy here. The changes that Lewis has wanted, his new engineer, he's got his brakes that he wanted. That seems to be huge. And you've seen Leclerc talk about switching to his brakes. But I think Lewis is now confident with the brakes. He's confident with the aero. And it was just one of those moments where even without the VSC, and I feel sorry for Fernando Alonso and Aston Martin at the moment because that car is rubbish. We saw Stroll retire early. We had Fernando Alonso stop on track. And that seemed to be electrical issues, by the way. But that moment, I think, listen, it would have been nice to have seen Lewis go and use those 20 seconds that he ended up gapping to the Mercedes at the end of the race. It was nice to not have the worry, but it would have been nice to see him go and actually overtake Lando, Antonelli, and George, because I think he would have done. I think most people feel that he would have got that done, and it would be an even special win. But listen, you take the win. And I think that obviously the most important thing in the championship is Kimi Antonelli's DNF. Now, the gap's closed between Lewis and Kimi Antonelli to 41 points. It's obviously very manageable. The interesting thing is who's going to develop more? We're still very early into this season. Who's going to develop more, Ferrari or Mercedes? If somehow Ferrari can develop further, then maybe it's on. Maybe it genuinely is on. The other thing for George Russell, he had been passed by Antonelli. He looked weak at the end of that stint. But he got his luck. He unfortunately was unlucky. Or I should say maybe Kimi Antonelli got his unluck. He had the engine issue, and that's the same issue that George had a few weeks ago. And again, is that reliability going to play in to this season? Charles Leclerc, again, was unlucky with the power steering issue. Could that be, again, reliability for It's not all just Mercedes' unreliability here that's causing issues. We had Max Verstappen in the last race in Monaco. Reliability is going to play its part. And that's it. Drivers' championships are won with the team. You can't escape that. I thought there weren't really any super slow pit stops from the top guys today. And the ones fighting for the front anyway. Super win. The first for Lewis Hamilton at Ferrari. This first since Spa 2024. And that was the one, if you remember, where the shine was slightly taken off because George Russell actually crossed the line first, got to celebrate as the winner, but was disqualified for having an underweight car. So it's been a while, been over 600 days, but you saw today Lewis Hamilton looking unrelenting. When you have him on a strategy where he can chase like that, or just anything where you need that Lewis magic and he trusts the car, you just don't feel it's going to go wrong. He's not going to crash. There are other drivers where you maybe feel it could crash. Now, anyway, I'm obviously ecstatic as a Lewis fan. I think it's great for the sport, and I'm excited to see what happens. For Charles Leclerc, it's been a tricky few weeks. He had his crash in Monaco. He had unreliability, and he crashed in qualifying. Now, Charles Leclerc is an unbelievably good driver. He is very, very quick in qualifying, and I think him and Lewis will probably still be very close in qualifying. On the Sunday, there's obviously been question marks around him sometimes, but he's not necessarily had the car. But Leclerc's still got a role this season, and I still think he has the ability to win. For George Russell, I think he can take positives from today. The championship gap is closed. Mercedes is still favourite. They've still got probably the best car. And he was quicker on the Saturday. Mr. Saturday of old was Mr. Saturday on Saturday. And I think he can be optimistic that he can take this battle to Kimi Antonelli. And Kimi Antonelli is also going to get bad luck. And sometimes you need that. You just need that little boost, and we can see what happens in George's preferred circuits. Jacques Villeneuve was saying that he's still not super confident with George on the Sunday. And I would say that's fair. We've seen some excellent races from George, though, and he's won some excellent races. Where he's maybe not as good as a Max or Lewis is when he's stuck in the pack and has to go through. And there was some defending today which you come into question for, but they were at the end of the stint. I think at some point in this season, we're going to see George and Antonelli dropped back into the pack. And it's whether or not they can make it through the pack. Now, that happened to George in Monaco. You're not going to make any dent in Monaco. So I think that's what we've got to see from them. I know we've never seen Kimi Antonelli have to fight through, getting dropped to 13th. Max had his spin earlier in the season, remember? He got spun. Obviously, got loads of plaudits for spinning, but he spun and he did make his way back through, did a decent recovery drive. And we've seen magic from him, from Lewis. And last year, again, we saw Lando Norris actually come through the pack. And when you've got the overspeed in the car, that's going to happen. But can you make it stick? Are the tyres right? Can you overtake? There's a huge part for a driver is to see, can they make their way through a pack? And listen, if you've watched the podcast for a while, you know I've spoken about that a lot as one of the things that stand out for a driver. Can you build the gap at the front? And can you drive and lead from the front and win from the front after a pole? That's a huge thing that drivers don't find out until they're in that position. And can you come through the grid? And again, recovery drive, maybe and take first position. That's the big deal. So, I think we've spoken enough about the top people. Who do I want to speak about next? Let's talk about McLaren. So Lando Norris managed to stick pretty tight within a second and a half to Antonelli. Super race. They were confident going through practice, actually, and it fell away in qualifying. McLaren. Now, Piastri's been really off the boil recently. He's not as comfortable, clearly, with the setup as Lando. You could hear on the Mercedes team radio, they kept talking about the threat of Lando Norris because they knew that he was an undercut threat. He was close enough to maybe undercut, definitely undercut Kimi Antonelli, but maybe undercut George even. So that kept the pressure on them. In many ways, Lando Norris acted as the second Ferrari car. If Ferrari had their car there, they would have maybe tried to run a similar strategy to what Lando Norris was running. So maybe fortunate for Lewis that happened. Now, Lando Norris, I think very impressive. Now, remember, Kimi Antonelli actually was getting track limits, and he got awarded the penalty after the race, even though he DNF'd. A little bit of immaturity there. So even though he got past George, probably would have dropped to third. It seemed that they did manage to slightly break that gap away from Lando towards the end. So whether or not Lando would have got in there, we'll see. But I was really impressed by that and disappointed by Oscar Piastri, who I think after the deflation of last year of not winning the championship, is clearly not as settled this year in the car. But listen, you don't lose your abilities as a driver. We've seen Oscar Piastri be a brilliant driver. And I think he has the temperament and mindset to come back. I think what's difficult is that Lando Norris needs confidence, and he got the confidence from last year's championship. So he's still buoyed by that. I don't think he feels that the McLaren is capable of winning a championship this year. Podiums, yes, maybe some upgrades. They got a Mercedes engine, so if they can get their aero package right, who knows? But I think realistically, they're looking for podiums, and that's what Oscar Piastri is going to start doing, and particularly sort out his qualifying. Next, after McLaren, I want to talk about the Alpines. Pierre Gasly and Colapinto lined up on the 7th row after qualifying, but they put in a great race, and Pierre Gasly and Colapinto have been quite close. I was particularly rating Colapinto recently. He didn't slow under the yellows, so he ended up with a 10-second time penalty. You remember Lewis Hamilton was under investigation, but you could see he was really close to where Alonso went off, so there was no further investigation. But that's a bit silly. Those are the sorts of little things that can add up. So he went from an 8th to a 10th, but still a points finish. And I think Alpine can be happy. Now, the controversial thing in the race, which felt very Flavio Briatore, was the order to swap. And this, the way it was delivered, it was a swap now. I mean, it was a good, forceful message from the team in that it basically allowed no argument. And listen, they're not fighting for the front in the same way, and it's still pretty early in the season. I think they're ultimately right to do that. You could see Gasly was able to press forward, challenge forward, and Colapinto, he ultimately did manage to hold off for 8th before his silly error that cost him some places. And who do they cost places to? The Racing Bulls. Now, Liam Lawson is having a very good season. Last year was a pretty tough year for him. Obviously at the beginning, getting demoted, but Liam Lawson's good enough to be in Formula One. And have to say, obviously, had just been able to find form a bit quicker, and his gap to Max is definitely less than what Liam's was. But this is what can happen if you actually stick with a driver and you can see how they can flourish. And Gasly had that done. Look him, he's now a lead driver in a team. Liam Lawson's leading that Red Bull team to Lindblad. And Lindblad, again, a decent performance. He had some performances this year that were slightly underrated as well. And I think they can be very happy with that. Everyone keeps telling me they've got the nicest looking car. I think it's just because I hate the idea of a Red Bull second team. I've never really liked that livery. But yeah, it's nice. And so that's who looks like the best of the rest at the moment, is Alpine and the Racing Bulls. Hulkenberg was unlucky with his DNF. He was going really well. And you've got to say, for Audi, that's super. And yeah, putting in impressive performances. And again, Nico Hulkenberg is not someone, we were talking about this actually during the race, he's not someone that you feel often initiates contact. He's pretty good at staying out of trouble. And that consistency is able to buy that team points this year. And those points are going to be really valuable. Albon in the Williams is having a difficult season. I think we've got to be blunt and say he's having a tricky season. He's had some misfortune, but Sainz has definitely got the upper hand at the moment in the Williams. In the Haas, it was interesting actually seeing when Ocon and Behrman fight a little bit at the beginning of the race. They were close, and Ocon and teammates can always be spicy. But it's difficult for Haas. They're not hitting the cost cap at the moment. Are they really going to challenge forward? They're overperforming. If we're blunt, they're overperforming. Aston Martin are absolutely nowhere, and it was Fernando Alonso's last Barcelona race. He crashed out from his grandstand that's named after him. It's definitely his last race because he might not be there next year, but also there's no Barcelona next year, so we're not going to be seeing him in 2 years' time. Anyway, so we had quite a lot of DNFs. Yeah, Bortoletto, without Hulkenberg being there, managed to get 11th. No points, sadly, for him. But the Audis are still a step back at the moment from really being able to consistently fight for points. Carlos Sainz, say, outperforming Albon at the moment in 12th. and Esteban Ocon managing to get 13th. But again, you're seeing where they're falling down the order at the moment. And it's tricky for those teams, particularly when you feel like points aren't on the cards. And I'm not seeing the ability at the moment for kind of the crazy strategy to hold on to 10th. The differentials between the teams mean we're seeing them fall into these categories. And of course, last but not least, is Max Verstappen and the Red Bulls. We've skipped over them. Max, yeah, tricky. The Red Bulls not managed to have the upgrade packages that the other cars have. You saw he was stronger earlier in the year, and they've fallen a little bit behind in development. He's complaining throughout the practice sessions and the qualifying, doesn't trust the car as much. And yeah, you can tell that. Also, Hadjar's a bit closer to him at the moment. But 4th place, I don't think they can be disappointed with that, given where the car is. But yeah, they've got a lot to work on, Red Bull. A lot to work on to be able to challenge forward. And it will be interesting to see at what point in the season teams start focusing more on next year. But at the moment, you would definitely feel that Mercedes, Ferrari, and then the McLarens, maybe nestled in quite closely behind, are really capable of making this championship exciting. And we've got the drivers at the front to make it happen. So next time out is Austria. We're also a few weeks away from British Grand Prix. So maybe we can also see a British 1, 2, 3 like we did today. Everyone have told you a million times, but it was the first time since 1968. So that was pretty cool to see them all up there. George Russell's ongoing struggles as the middle child in Toto Wolff's favourability made me laugh as well. Toto wasn't seeming to be that happy with a George Russell P2. I mean, it was tricky. I think the Antonelli DNF was difficult for Mercedes, and ultimately they got outplayed strategy-wise by Ferrari. But vindicated to go to Ferrari? Yes. Fred Vasseur sticking with Lewis Hamilton? Yes. This season there were some hilarious rumours, obviously, about would this be Lewis's last year, but my God, have we been proven wrong. The Ferrari team look energised. Lewis is getting on with his engineer. He's got the Kim Kardashian factor. The curses have cancelled one another out, and he's flying high. So I cannot wait to the next race. Marshals, it's been a pleasure, and I will catch you next time.